The freight wagon came up the Ember Fork Road a little before noon, and Ansel Merritt did not go out to meet it. He stood in the door of the ranch house with his fur cap in his hands and watched the woman climb down over the wheel on her own, a worn carpet bag in one fist and a small girl's hand in the other. She set the bag down in the frozen dirt the way a person sets down a thing they have carried a long way, with both hands and a kind of care. Then she straightened her back and looked at the house and at the man in the doorway, and she did not look away. Ansel had pictured somebody else. He could not have told you who. Younger, maybe, a face that weather and grief had not already gotten to. The woman in his yard was plain as a cedar post, brown hair pulled back hard under a bonnet gone gray at the brim. A travel dress mended at the cuff in stitches so small a man would have to know to look for them. The child against her skirt was thin and watchful and had her mother's steady eyes. Rube Tandy, the wagon boss, leaned on the top corral rail with a dead cigarette between two fingers. He looked the woman over once, slow, and said it loud enough to carry. "Thought you sent off for a cook, Ansel, not somebody's tired aunt." Two of the younger hands laughed before they knew better. One of them quit when nobody else kept it up. Her name was Effie Rusk, and she had come a very long way to a place that did not want her. She was 32 years old, though the road had made her look older, and she had buried a husband on the Kansas grade the spring before last. Jonah Rusk had been a steady man with good hands and a bad lung, and the fever that ran through the railroad camp took him in 9 days. They laid him in the hard prairie ground with 16 other men that season. And a line foreman gave Effie $4 silver and a week to clear out of the cook tent. She had not cleared out. She had stayed and cooked, because 40 men still needed feeding twice a day, and the new foreman could not find another soul who would do it for what the company paid. So she fed them, out of a sheet iron stove and 3 Dutch ovens and a stoneware crock she kept warm against her own body on the cold nights. And she fed them well enough that hard men who had never thanked anybody in their lives began to take their hats off when they came through her line. She had learned that work the only way a person ever learns it, which is by doing it past the point of being able to, and then doing it again the next morning. She had learned to stretch a barrel of flour, and to make a tough old range cow eat tender, and to bake bread on open ground in a wind. And she had learned it all with her girl under her feet, Verity, 5 years old that summer, who could crack an egg into a bowl before she knew all her letters. When the grade pushed on west and the camp folded up behind it, there was no more work for a cook, and there was a widow with a child and $4 and no people anywhere in the world who would take her in. That was the long and the short of how she came to answer the notice. A storekeeper's wife named Mrs. Peck had placed it, on behalf of a cattleman up in the Montana high country who had lost his wife 2 winters back and lately his old cook besides, and who wanted a woman to run his house and feed the men who worked his range. The notice had not promised love and had not pretended to. Effie answered it in a plain hand on a torn half-sheet, and she told the truth. Because the truth was all she had left to bargain with. That she was a widow with a daughter she would not leave behind. That she was no beauty and laid no claim to be one, that she could cook for a crowd and keep a house and was not afraid of hard country or hard men. The letter that came back was 4 lines long in a heavy, careful hand. It said the writer's name was Ansel Merritt, that he ran cattle and cut timber on the Ember Fork, that the work would be steady and the pay her keep and a home, and that the fare was enclosed and she could come, or not, as she chose. There had been a banknote folded inside it. There had not been one single word about a child. Effie had read that letter a dozen times on the road north, trying to decide whether the man had made his peace with Verity or had simply never let the fact of her land at all. Now, standing in his yard with her bag in the dirt and his face in the doorway gone tight and disappointed, she had her answer. He had not let it land. He had not, she thought, read her close enough to have to. The freighter who had carried her the last 40 miles had pointed out the country as the mules pulled north. the Ember Fork running black between white banks. Timber going up the slopes in dark ranks until it quit at the line where nothing grows. And above all of it, across the whole north of the world, the divide itself, blue and white and enormous. She had never seen so much sky in her life, and it had frightened her and steadied her both. Now she stood inside that country on the place she had crossed 1,500 miles to reach, and the man showed her his house and did not pretend it was more than it was. 3 rooms and a dog trot and a lean-to off the back where the meat hung in the cold months. The kitchen had not been swept in a week and the stove was dead, and a film of old grease lay over everything the dead cook had left behind. On a shelf above the dry sink there was a woman's sewing basket and a hairbrush with a few pale hairs still caught in it, sitting untouched, the way the belongings of the dead are sometimes left to keep watch. Effie's eyes went to them and moved on, and she said nothing, and she did not touch them then or after. By the cold hearth a one-eyed cow dog lay in the ashes and did not get up. "My wife kept it better," Ansel said. He said it without any softness, the way a man states a fact he has worn smooth from handling. Deborah passed 2 winters back. The cook held it together after, more or less. Old Fen is 3 weeks in the ground and the fall work start Monday. He turned the cap in his hands. "I will be straight with you, Mrs. Rusk. I sent off for a woman who could keep this place and feed my outfit. I did not rightly think on a child. The freight wagon goes back to the rail Monday noon. You will want to think on whether you mean to be on it." Verity had crossed the dirty floor to the dog. She sat down in front of it and held her small hand flat before its nose, the careful way a child offers herself to an animal she does not yet trust. And the dog opened its one good eye and looked at her a long moment, and did not pull away. Effie looked at her daughter, and at the dead stove, and at the man who had already half decided to send her back to a place where she had no place at all. "I will cook you a supper tonight," she said. "Then you can decide what you decide." She set her bag in the corner and took off her bonnet and began to roll back her sleeves. She did not wait to be shown where anything was. She found the broom and the lye soap and the wood, and she set that kitchen to rights with the plain, hard motion of a woman who has cleaned a great many kitchens that were not her own. She got the firebox cleaned and the chimney drawing in a blaze going, and scrubbed the table and the dry sink and the floor down to the grain of the boards. Out in the lean-to she found sprouting onions and a sack of pinto beans and a side of salt pork, and by the time the light failed she had a pot of beans on with the pork laid over, cornbread baking, and coffee that did not taste like the bottom of a creek. The near-pasture hands came in at dusk, 5 of them, stamping the cold off their boots. They ate what she set down and drank her coffee, and most of them said nothing, because that was the way of them. Absalom Wicklow said something. He was the oldest hand on the place, ballig, with a white mustache stained yellow at the corners, and a way of sitting so still the young ones took it for sleep. He had watched her the whole meal. Her hands, the set of her back, the way the little girl carried the tin cups to the table without being told. At the end of it he wiped his plate clean with his bread. "Where did you learn to cook, ma'am?" "Railroad camp," Effie said. Wicklow nodded slow and said nothing more. But something had shifted behind his old eyes and gone quiet and settled. Rube Tandy pushed his plate back and tipped his chair onto 2 legs. "Beans is one thing," he said. "Any woman alive can boil a pot of beans. Feeding a works outfit is a different animal. Cyrus Fenn put up a noon meal for 20 riders out of that chuck wagon, hot on the ground in the wind every day of the gather, and it broke harder men than him before it was through." He smiled at her without any warmth in it. "No offense meant, ma'am, but that is not a tired widow's work." Effie was pouring the coffee, and she did not stop pouring. "None taken," she said. She filled his cup, though he had not asked for it, and she went on down the table. and the laugh he had been building behind his teeth died in his chest before he could let it loose. She found the crock on Saturday morning. It was on the high shelf at the back of the pantry, where a thing goes when nobody wants to look at it and nobody can quite bring himself to throw it out. A stoneware crock the size of a milk pail, brown glazed and heavy as a stone, with a wooden lid weighted by a rock and a strip of sacking tied over the whole of it. Effie got it down with both arms and set it on the table and untied the sacking and lifted the lid. There was a crust across the top the color of ash, cracked into plates like dried mud in a dry year. It smelled of nothing much. Any sensible person would have carried it out and dumped it in the yard. Effie put her nose down close and breathed in slow. And under the ash and the dust and the 3 weeks of neglect there it was, faint, sour, alive. Then she lifted the crust off in one piece and threw it out, and underneath was a gray sludge that looked like nothing on this earth, and she stirred it and it moved thick and slow and gave up a smell like green apples and old beer. She fed it. Warm water first, and then flour, worked in until it was the thickness of a batter, and she set it on the shelf behind the stove where the heat came around and covered it with a clean cloth. Then she stood there and talked to it, low, the way she had learned to do on the cold Kansas nights when there was nobody else in the dark to talk to at all. Absalom Wicklow found her at it an hour later and stopped in the door. "You woke Fenn's crock," he said. "It was not dead. It was only cold and hungry, which is a different thing." The old man came in and looked down into it, and something moved in his face that she could not read. "He carried that up from Missouri in '51, Wicklow said, in a wagon with a wet cloth over it, and he slept with it between his knees so it would not freeze. 31 years he fed it. Every single day, ma'am. It went up the trail and back 11 times, and there is not a man on this place, nor a horse, nor a stick of this house, as old as what is in that crock." Effie looked down at the gray sludge coming slowly awake. He would not sell a start of it. Men offered him money, and he would not take it. He said a thing like that cannot be bought, it can only be given, and it has to be given to somebody who will feed it, because the day you stop feeding it is the day it is gone, and there is no getting it back. He was quiet a moment. "Nobody has fed it in 3 weeks. Somebody is feeding it now," said Effie Rusk. By Saturday afternoon, the men were watching her the way men watch a thing they have already decided will not last. She heard 2 of them by the corral betting tobacco on how many days before the boss put her on the wagon. She went on hanging her wash and said nothing, because a person cannot argue with a thing like that. Only outlast it. She kept the house and kept to herself. She did not touch Deborah Merritt's sewing basket or her hairbrush. She was gentle with the half-broke wrangler boy named Cy, who stuttered and whom the others rode hard about it, and with the old one-eyed dog who had begun by Saturday evening to follow her from the stove to the woodpile and back. Ansel saw none of it, or made himself not see it. The house that had gone cold and silent after Deborah stayed that way inside him, even with a fire in the stove and a child's voice in the next room. Because he had built his grief into a wall and lived behind it on purpose for 2 years, and did not mean to let any plain widow's cooking breach it. But Wicklow saw. And the wrangler boy saw. And Verity, who missed nothing anywhere, saw a great deal. On Saturday night, the child carried Ansel's coffee out to where he sat alone on the porch step in the dark. She carried it in both hands the careful way her mother had taught her, and set it down by his boot without a word, and went back in. And Ansel Merritt sat with that cup of coffee going cold beside him for a long time, and did not drink it, and could not have told anybody why his throat had closed up the way it had. The trouble came on Sunday, and from 2 directions at once. The first was a letter. It had come up with the freighter along with Effie and sat 2 days on the shelf by the door, because Ansel Merritt knew what was in it and had not been in a hurry. It was from the bank at Camas Wells, and it said in the courteous way such letters say such things that the note on the Longwater came due the 15th of December, and that the bank would be pleased to consider a renewal on evidence that the season's beef had been delivered and sold. 1,200 head to the railhead, 60 miles of hard country. Before the middle of December. Ansel had known it since March and planned around it since March, and every part of that plan had assumed a cook. The second thing came at noon by way of a rider off the Bitterroot Road, and it was worse. Pruitt, the cook Ansel had hired to take Cyrus Fenn's place for the works, had taken on with a bigger outfit down the valley and would not be coming to the Ember Fork after all. He sent his regrets by a stranger, which is how a man sends regrets he does not much feel. Ansel stood in the dog trot with that news in his chest and understood the trouble he was in all the way to the bottom of it. The gather started Monday. 18 men and a wagon on the high benches for 3 weeks, and then 1,200 head north 60 miles in the first hard weather of the year. And the whole of it, the season and the note and the Longwater itself, ran through a cook fire. And there was not a soul on the place who could tend one, but a woman he had been about to put on a wagon. He went into the kitchen. Effie was there with a lamp lit against the early dark, mending a tear in the hem of Verity's dress. The child was asleep on a folded quilt by the stove, and the dog was stretched out beside her on the hearth, where it had not lain for any living soul in 2 years. Ansel stood in the door. There was no part of him that wanted to ask the woman in the apron for anything, and he asked her the only question he had left in the world to ask. "Can you cook for a whole outfit?" He meant it half as a challenge and half as a drowning man's reach for any hand at all, and he braced himself for her to flinch from it, or to make some small, modest noise, or to boast and promise. She did none of the three. She set her needle down in her lap. She looked at him level across the lamplight with her plain, steady face. And she said, "How many men and what time do they ride in?" It stopped him where he stood. He had not known what he expected. It had not been that. 18, he said. And I do not know. Tomorrow evening, if the gather goes. Later if it does not. What have you got in the stores? Flour, beans, coffee, dried apples, sugar, salt, a side of beef hung in the lean-to and a steer on the hoof if you want to kill fresh. He had to think. Lard, a jug of molasses, chilies? Fenn kept a sack of them somewhere. Effie nodded. It was a small, certain nod, the nod of a person who has already begun the work somewhere inside herself before the talking is finished. She set the mending aside and rose and took down the dead cook's flour sack apron from its nail by the door and tied it on over the one she was already wearing. "I will want the wrangler to kill that steer tonight and hang it to cool," she said, "and the boy to keep me in wood until morning. Go on to bed, Mr. Merritt. There will be food when they come." He stood a moment longer. "You understand it is my whole place riding on the works this year." "I understood that when I read your letter," Effie said. "A man does not send fair money to a stranger in September unless he is out of other ideas." Ansel had no answer for that at all. He put his cap on and went out. She did not sleep that night, nor mean to. She got the sourdough working first, because that was the heart of it and everything else waited on it. What had been gray sludge on Saturday morning had come up domed and bubbling and smelling sharp and clean, and she stood in the lamplight with her hand flat on the warm side of that crock, and felt something go through her she did not have a word for. She fed it heavy and set it back in the warm. Then she set the beans to soak in the great iron pot with strips of salt pork laid across the top, and rendered lard in a kettle until the kitchen ran with the smell of it. She went out with a lantern to where the wrangler had hung the fresh-killed steer and cut what she needed for the dish the men on the grade had called son-of-a-gun stew. Heart and liver and sweetbreads and marrow gut, cleaned and cut down small, and set to simmer slow with onion and a good handful of the dried red chilies she had turned up at the back of Fenn's shelf. A stew like that fed cold men from the inside out in a way plain boiled beef never would, and she had made it 400 times. She built the cobbler in the deepest Dutch oven on the place. Dried apples plumped soft in hot water and sugar, a long pour of dark molasses worked through, a thick biscuit crust laid over, and she set the oven where it would bake low and even through the small hours. The kitchen grew warm. The windows ran with steam against the cold pressing on the other side of the glass. Verity slept on by the stove with her rag doll in the crook of one arm and the one-eyed dog curled into the warm of her back. Effie worked on. When the dough came up, she punched it down and let it come a second time, and along about 4 in the deep cold of the morning she began to bake, pan after pan, in Dutch ovens set into beds of glowing coals with more hot coals heaped onto the lids, which is the only way to do it right for a crowd. By the time the black in the east began to thin, she had 5 dozen biscuits laid by, tall and golden and split along their tops. The stew had cooked down dark and thick. The cobbler crust had risen brown and cracked open over the bubbling apples. The coffee was set to boil. She washed her face in cold water and retied her hair and put a clean apron on over the other 2, and woke Verity gently and set her to laying the tin plates down the long table. Then there was nothing to do but feed the fire and wait, and she stood at the steamed window with her raw hands around a cup of her own coffee and watched a cold gray morning come up hard over a country that did not yet know what she could do. They came in at dusk, and they came in bad. The gather had gone long. The cattle on the high benches were scattered worse than anybody figured, and the country up there was rough, and the light failed them, and 18 men had been on the ground since 4 in the morning in a wind that never once let up. They came up the road bunched and bent low with their collars turned and their horses' manes streaming sideways off their necks. 18 cold and hollowed-out men, riding and expecting at the very most cold leftovers handed out grudging by a hired woman who knew nothing of their work. They smelled it before they saw anything. The wind carried it down the road to meet them, beef and chili and coffee and fresh bread laid over the top of all that cold, and a young hand named Marlowe lifted his frozen face into it and said, "What in the round world is that?" Not one man answered him, because not one of them wanted to say the thing out loud and then ride in and find it was not so. They came into the yard and swung down stiff and led their horses to the corral with hands too cold to work the latches, and came across the lot stamping and blowing into their fists, and came up to the long kitchen where Cyrus Fenn had fed them all those years and stopped dead in the door. There was a fire roaring in the stove, and a table laid the whole length of the room. A tin platter heaped with biscuits at either end, a kettle of dark stew on the trivet, a Dutch oven of apple cobbler with its lid off and the steam standing straight up out of it. There was hot coffee, and there was a plain woman in a flour sack apron standing by the stove with a small girl at her side. "Come in out of it and sit down," she said. "There is plenty, and there is more on the stove." For a long moment not one man moved. Then Absalom Wicklow took off his hat, and the others took theirs off after him. 18 cold men bearing their heads in a warm kitchen, and they came to the table and sat down on the benches, and Effie Rusk began to fill the plates. She filled them high. She went down the table ladling the stew, and Verity came behind her laying biscuits too to a plate. And the men took up their forks, and the room went quiet. It went quiet the way a thing goes quiet when something is happening that nobody wants to be the one to break. The scrape of forks on tin, the snap of the fire, and under it the small private sounds of cold and starving men eating hot food, and not one word spoken anywhere along that bench. A hard old hand named Grady with a face like a dropped saddle broke open a biscuit, and the steam came up out of the heart of it. He laid a little butter in and ate the half of it in one bite. Then he stopped chewing and sat very still with his eyes down on his plate, and the men on either side looked away to give him the moment. Because every one of them had been a long time from anything that tasted like a kitchen a woman kept. Rube Tandy ate without a word. He ate a full plate of the stew and 4 biscuits, and then held his plate out without looking up, and Effie filled it again, and he ate that too. The speech he had made on Friday night about boiling beans and tired widows sat there in the warm room with all of them. And nobody had to say a thing about it, because the eating said the whole of it for him. When the platters had gone to crumbs and the second pot of stew was scraped to its bottom, Effie set the cobbler at the head of the table and spooned it into the clean tin cups with hot apple syrup over each one. And 18 grown men ate dried apple cobbler in the lamplight. And somebody let out a long, slow breath. And for a while, that breath and the fire and the wind were the only sounds in the world. Ansel had come in out of the weather and stood with his back against the cold wall by the door. And he watched the whole of it. He watched his outfit, men who grumbled at him and would not bend an inch for any soft thing under heaven, take their hats off for this woman without being asked, and eat what she set down like men who had come a long way home. He had not known a kitchen could do that to a room full of hard men. He had taught himself to forget it after Deborah, when the going silent of the house had been a wound he kept open on purpose, so he would not have to feel it close over a thing he could not get back. Now he stood against the cold boards and felt something rise in him that he had no name ready for and did not trust. A loosening. A thing too much like hope to be safe. Wicklow wiped his mouth and pushed back from the bench and turned around to face the room. He looked across it at Effie where she stood by the stove with the ladle in her hand. "I know you," he said. Every head along the table came up. "I have been trying to place it since Friday evening, and it come to me in the night, plain as day. The Kansas Pacific grade, the spring of '81. I was hauling a beef contract up to the construction camps that whole season. There was a cook tent on the Cottonwood Cut where a woman fed the gang after the camp lost its cook to the fever, and the boys up and down that line used to say it was the only camp on the grade worth getting sick to eat at." His old eyes did not move off her face. "That was you. That is your bread. I would know it anywhere on this earth. I ate it 3 weeks running, and I have not forgot it in 5 years." Effie stood by the stove with the ladle in her hand, and the color came up slow in her plain face. And for the first time since she had stepped down off that wagon, she looked as though she might not hold steady. "It was me," she said. "My husband took the fever on that grade. I stayed on after and cooked." Wicklow nodded, slow and grave, the way a man nods who is witnessing to a truth in a church. "Then this here is the luckiest outfit on the Ember Fork," he said, "and it has not got the sense yet to know it." He looked over at Rube Tandy. "Has it, Rube?" And every man on that bench turned and looked at the wagon boss. Tandy set down his cup. He took his time about it. He was not a cruel man, whatever else he was, but he was a man who had spent 19 years being right about who could do the work and who could not, and it was the only thing he had. "It was a fine supper," he said. "I will say that in front of anybody. It is the finest supper I have ate in this house since Cyrus Fenn was above ground." "But," said Wicklow, "but one meal in a warm kitchen with a roof and a floor under you is not the works." Tandy looked down the table and then at Effie, and there was no malice left in his face, only a flat old certainty. "The works is a wagon and open ground and wind, ma'am. 3 weeks of it and then 60 miles of trail in December. I have watched 2 grown men quit that job, and one of them was younger than you and had no child hanging on him." He stood up and put his hat on. "I hope I am wrong. But I have not been wrong about this in 19 years, and I am not going to start saying a thing I do not believe, because the biscuits were good." Now, before this story goes on, the narrator would put a question to you who are listening in the warm dark of your own evening. You have surely known a person the world looked straight past. Somebody nobody expected anything of, who turned out to be the one holding the whole thing up. Stay with this story to the end, and tell us in the comments below who that person was in your life, and where you are listening from tonight. Because Rube Tandy was not wrong about the works. He was only wrong about the woman. They rolled the chuck wagon out on Wednesday morning. Effie had gone over it Tuesday from tongue to tailgate and found it the way a dead man's wagon usually is. Exactly right in every particular that mattered to him, and a mess in every one that did not. She had a new hoop put on the water barrel and traded 2 crippled Dutch ovens for 1 good one and a sack of onions, and loaded the wagon herself with the boy Cy carrying and Verity counting the crates out loud. And she put the crock in the chuck box, wedged in with sacking on every side, in the warmest corner where the box took the sun. Wicklow watched her do it and said nothing at all, but he took his hat off again, which for that old man was a whole speech. Then she took the outfit out onto the high benches and fed them, and Rube Tandy learned he had been wrong for the first time in 19 years. She fed them hot at noon and hot again at dark, on open ground, in wind, for 18 days. She learned that wagon in 3 of them, and after that she was ahead of it. She learned to set the box in the lee of the wind and the fire in the lee of the wagon, and which draws had dry wood and which had only green. She had her pit dug and her ovens in the coals while the outfit was still coming off the ridge, so a man swinging down at dark had a plate in his hand inside 4 minutes. She baked bread every day out of Cyrus Fenn's crock and fed the crock every day, and on the 2 nights the cold got under 20 below, she took the whole crock into her blankets and slept curled around it, which the men saw and did not say 1 word about. The outfit learned the rattle of her wagon coming over a rise, and to mind their tongues at her fire, and to scrape their own plates into the wreck pan, and to bring her dry wood before she had to ask. The young ones brought her things they could not have explained the bringing of. A fat sage hen knocked down with a thrown rock, a hatful of late choke cherries, and from the boy Marlowe, a length of red ribbon bought off the shelf at the store in Camas Wells, which he gave to Verity with his ears gone scarlet. Rube Tandy said nothing for 11 days. On the 12th he came to her fire in the gray before dawn while she was setting her ovens, and stood a while with his hands in his pockets. "I have et better on this gather than I et on the last 4, he said, looking at the fire and not at her. "That is a fact, and I do not like it much, but there it is." "You do not have to like it, Mr. Tandy, no, but there is one more thing yet. The drive." "The drive." He nodded once. 60 miles in December, and the weather owns you the whole way. A ranch kitchen is a building. A gather is close to home. The trail is neither one. He looked at her then. "I hope you make a liar out of me. I am starting to believe you might. But I have buried men off a December trail, and I would not be square with you if I let you go up it thinking it was going to be like these 18 days. I do not think anything is going to be like anything," Effie said. "I think a person does the next thing and then the one after it." Tandy almost smiled and took his coffee and walked away. On the last night of the gather, a timber contractor named Ivor Shattuck camped in beside the Longwater wagon and ate 2 suppers and a breakfast at Effie's fire. On the second morning, he offered her $40 a month in gold, better than twice a top hand's wages, to throw in with his outfit and cook his camps through the winter cut. She thanked him plain and told him no. She told him she had found the place she meant to stay. Shattuck looked from her to where Ansel Merritt stood across the firelight pretending hard not to listen, and grinned under his mustache and never asked her twice. Ansel had heard the offer and heard her turn it down, and he carried that all the way home down the cold road. The gold she had said no to, and the word she had said it with, and he could not any longer make himself sorry for one single thing about the day she had stepped down into his yard with her bag in the dirt. They started the beef north on the 8th of December. 1,200 head, 18 riders, a remuda of 90 horses, and 1 wagon. 60 miles to the pens at Camas Wells over country that ran open and rolling for 2 days before it dropped into the breaks along the Ember Fork. The first 2 days were as good as December ever gives. Cold and still and gray, the herd stringing out easy, the men in good humor because good weather on a December drive is a thing a man knows better than to expect. Effie ran the wagon ahead and had noon on the ground when they reached it and supper down before full dark, and Verity rode the seat beside her with the one-eyed dog across her feet, because the dog had refused with great dignity to be left at the house. On the second night, Ansel Merritt came to the wagon after the others had rolled into their blankets. Effie was banking her fire for the morning. He stood at the edge of the light with his cap in his hands. "The day you come, I looked at you in my yard and I decided inside of 1 minute that you would not do." His voice was rough with it. "I want you to know that I know that. I have thought on it every day since, and I have not found any way to make it sit better." Effie went on banking the fire. "You had a picture in your head," she said. "Most people do. Mine did not match it. That is not a crime, Miss Merritt. It was not the picture." He looked at the ground. "Deborah kept that house 11 years. When she went, I let it go cold on purpose. Every plate that never got washed, that was me keeping the hole open, because as long as that house was wrong, then she was lately gone instead of long gone." He turned the cap, and then a stranger walks into it, and inside of 6 hours the stove is lit, and there is bread rising, and it was like watching somebody close a grave I had been sitting beside. I hated it. God forgive me, I hated you for about a day and a half. "I know," Effie said. Ansel's head came up. "You knew." "Mr. Merritt, I buried a husband." She set the last of the ash over her coals. "There is not one thing about a grief a person can hide from somebody who has had one. I knew what those hairbrush hairs were doing on that shelf the minute I saw them. I have not touched that shelf, and I do not intend to." He stood in the dark a while. "I would not have blamed you if you had got on that wagon Monday noon." "I had nowhere to be on Monday noon," said Effie. "That is not the same as having chosen this. But I have chosen it since, and I would like that on the table between us, so neither of us has to wonder." Ansel Merritt looked at her across the banked coals a long moment, and then put his cap on and said good night, and walked back to the herd, and did not sleep much. The front came on the third day. It came out of the northwest off the Canadian line with no more warning than a change in the color of the sky and a stillness in the cattle, and every man who had wintered in that country felt it an hour before there was anything to see. A hard, dry shifting, and a smell to it like cold iron. Tandy came back down the line at a lope with his face set. 12 hours early. At the least. And it is a bad one, Ansel. Look at the north of it. The whole north was the color of a gun barrel, coming on with a flat black line under it that ran the entire width of the world. How far to the breaks? 6 miles. Maybe 7. There was shelter in the breaks, cut banks and broken ground where a herd could be held out of the worst of a wind. 6 miles was 2 hours with 1,200 head. They did not have 2 hours. "Push them," Ansel said. They pushed them, and were still a mile and a half short of the first cut bank when the front hit the herd broadside and the whole country went white. Effie had the wagon a half-mile ahead of the herd when it came, and what saved her and the child both was that she had spent 18 days learning to read a sky over a cook fire and had already stopped. She had the wagon pulled into the lee of a low cut bank at the head of a dry draw, the only broken ground within 2 miles. The mules unhitched and tied on the sheltered side. And she was throwing the canvas over the box when it arrived. It did not build. It arrived. The wind came across that flat with a sound like a train going through a cut, and the snow came with it, not falling but traveling, sideways and level and so thick that the far end of her own wagon went out of the world. The cold came down 40 degrees in under an hour. Everything she had known about weather in Kansas turned out to be a rumor about weather. She got Verity into the wagon bed under the canvas with every blanket and the dog jammed in beside her, and the child, who was 6 years old and understood more than anybody had ever given her credit for, stayed there. Then Effie Rusk stood in the lee of that cutbank in a whiteout with her back to the wind and did the arithmetic. The herd had been a half-mile behind her in drifting. Cattle in a wind like that do not stand and do not turn. They walk downwind until something stops them, and they will walk 30 miles, and over the edge of anything that gets in the way. 18 men would be trying to hold them, and could not, and would be scattered along the flank of a herd that had already stopped being a herd. And once a man was off his horse or turned around in that white, he was in a country with no landmarks and no light. And he would walk downwind too, because a person always does, and he would keep walking until he lay down. There was no seeing. She could not see the mules at 15 feet. There was no hearing either. She stood at the corner of the wagon and put everything she had into a shout, and the wind took the sound off her mouth and had it 100 yards downwind before it finished coming out of her. A bell would not carry. A gun would not carry. Nothing that goes on the air as sound was going to reach one man out there. Effie stood in that roaring white with her hands in her armpits, thinking, and then she turned her face into the wind and stopped thinking about sound. Smell travels downwind. It travels better in a hard wind than a soft one, because the wind takes it and carries it in a long cone instead of letting it wander. Every one of those men was downwind of her, because downwind was the only direction the world had left. And a man walking blind, if he crossed a smell that was not snow and not cattle and not his own horse, would know two things about it: that somebody had made it, and that it was upwind of him. And a man will walk into a wind he cannot walk into, if he has a reason. She had an hour of light left, maybe less. She dug her fire pit in the deep lee where the cutbank turned and found the wind still reached into it and would strip a fire out in 10 minutes. So she dug again, further in under the overhang where the bank had cut back on itself, and built a firewall out of crate lids, and the wreck pan and 2 sacks of flour stood on end, and got a fire lit out of the last dry wood in the possum belly. Then she went at the wagon like a woman robbing it. She brought out the kettle of rendered lard, 11 pounds of it, the winter's grease, the side of salt pork, the onions and the sack of dried chilies, and the coffee, all 4 pounds of it. And the green pine she had picked up off the last camp for kindling and been annoyed to find was green. Rube Tandy had told her once that a person could smell her wagon coming over a rise. Effie Rusk built a fire that afternoon a person could smell in the next county. She laid the green pine on to make smoke, thick and white and resinous. She set the lard kettle over and let it get hot and started putting the salt pork in by the slab, and the fat came up off it in a smell that punched out of that draw and went downwind like a rope thrown across the dark. She cut onions into it by the double handful. She threw the chilies on the coals whole and they cracked and made a smell that took the breath. She boiled coffee and let it boil over on purpose and threw the grounds on the fire and boiled more. She burned the outfit's food. She burned the winter's grease and the salt pork and the coffee that had to last 60 miles, and she burned it in a fire that would cook nothing, for no reason except to put a smell on a wind. And she stood in the lee of that cutbank in the dark and fed it and waited to find out whether she had been right. The first man came in at about 7 o'clock. She never heard him. He appeared at the edge of the light, a shape crusted white from his hat to his boots, leading a horse worse off than he was, and stood swaying in front of that fire with his mouth open. It was the boy Marlowe, 19 years old, who had been walking downwind an hour and a half with his hands past hurting, and could not say anything at all for a while. Effie got him out of the wind and his gloves off and would not let him near the fire fast, and got coffee into him a little at a time. And while she did it, she understood a thing that made the whole world go quiet in her for 1 second. She had thought about getting them to the fire. She had not thought about being one woman with one fire and a 6-year-old. And that if she got 11 men in here half dead, she would have 11 men half dead in a draw in a blizzard with one kettle. "Mrs. Rusk," Marlowe said. His teeth were going like a nail rattle. "How did I find you?" "You smelled me." "I smelled pork," the boy said, wondering. "I thought I was dying. My uncle told me you smell your mother's kitchen when you are going." "You smelled pork, because there is pork," Effie said. "Now sit on that crate and put your hands in your own armpits and do not touch them. And when the next man comes in, you are the one who talks to him while I work. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. The second and third came in together at 8:30, 2 hands named Ivy and Grady, on one horse, because Ivy's had gone down in a coulee and broken a foreleg. Then nobody came for a long time. Effie fed the fire and fed it, and put the last of the green pine on, and then began burning the crates. Around 10 o'clock the fire began to lose. It was not the fuel. It was the wind. The front had backed around 2 points during the evening, the way they do, and the wind was coming into the mouth of that draw now instead of across it, and it got under the firewall and stripped the heat off the top of her fire and pulled the smoke flat along the ground where it did nobody any good at all. Effie stood and watched her beacon come apart. There was one other place. She had seen it in the last of the light, 40 yards up the draw where the cut bank turned again and undercut deep, a hollow big enough for a wagon and sheltered on 3 sides from the new wind. 40 yards, in that wind, in the dark, with no fire at the far end of it. If she let this one go out to move it, she would have nothing to light the new one with. Every match was gone. The tinder was gone. The dry wood was gone. There was fire in that pit and nowhere else in 60 miles of Montana. She needed to carry live coals 40 yards through a wind that would strip them off a shovel in 10 feet. Effie Rusk turned around and looked at the chuck box. The crock stood wedged in its corner with sacking packed around it, brown glazed and thick-walled and heavy as a stone. 31 years old. Carried up from Missouri under a wet cloth by a man who slept with it between his knees so it would not freeze. It was the only vessel on that wagon that would hold live fire and not crack and not burn her hands off through it. She got it down and pulled the sacking away and took the lid off, and the living sourdough was in there under its cloth, risen and working. Warm from the box. Effie scooped it out with both hands into a clean flour sack, every bit that would come, and tied the sack and opened her coat at the throat and put that cold, wet weight against the bare skin of her own belly and did the buttons up over it. Then she scraped the crock out and shoveled it 3/4 full of red coals from the bottom of her fire and laid the wooden lid on top and picked it up in both arms against her chest with the coals glowing up through the gaps. "Verity," she said. The child's face came out from under the canvas. "I am moving the fire. You will walk behind me and hold on to my coat, and you will not let go of it for anything on this earth." "Yes, Mama, and there is a job I need done that is the most important one on this wagon." Effie held her daughter's eyes. "When I set this crock down, I am going to give you the sack inside my coat. It is warm because I am warm. It has to stay warm, or it dies, and if it dies, it is gone forever, and there is no getting it back. It is 31 years old, V. It is older than every man out there in that snow. What do I do with it? You put it inside your own coat against your own skin, and you keep it there. That is the whole job, and there is nobody else on this wagon who can do it, because I am going to need my 2 hands all night." Verity Rusk climbed down out of that wagon into a blizzard and took hold of her mother's coat. "I can do that," she said. It took her 9 minutes to walk 40 yards. She walked bent over the crock with her body between it and the wind and her arms locked around it, and the heat came through the stoneware into her chest until she could smell her own coat scorching, and she did not put it down. Twice the wind knocked her sideways, and both times the small hand in the back of her coat held on. She set the crock down in the hollow under the bank, and the coals were still red. She had a fire going again inside 4 minutes, and this one held because the bank threw the wind up and over it, and the smoke stood in a column 20 feet before the wind got it and laid it flat down the draw. Then Effie opened her coat and got the sack out and put it into her daughter's hands. And the child buttoned it in against her own small chest and sat down on a crate beside the fire and did not move again for 6 hours. The fourth came in at 11. The fifth and sixth at midnight, one of them Wicklow, who had walked 2 miles leading a horse, and who sat down beside that fire and looked at the smoke going down the draw and then at Effie, and said, "Well," and said nothing else for some while. 7th and 8th at 1:30. 9th, 10th, 11th and 12th between 2 and 4 in the morning, in ones and twos out of the white, every one saying the same thing in the same order, that they had smelled it, that they had thought they were imagining it, that they had turned into the wind because there was nothing else left to turn into. Effie worked. There was no more coffee and no more pork and no more lard, so she boiled snow and got the men out of their wet things and into every blanket and slicker on the wagon, and set the ones who came in early to working on the ones who came in late, and kept the fire. She did not sit down between 7 o'clock at night and 8 in the morning. At 4 o'clock she had 14 men in that hollow and 4 unaccounted for. Ansel Merritt was one of them. At 5, 2 more came in together, and one was Rube Tandy. He was in a bad way. He had gone down with his horse in a coulee at the first of it and had been walking since, and had lost his right glove somewhere in the dark and put the hand inside his coat and kept walking. And when Effie got the coat open, his fingers were the color of a candle. She did not let him near the fire. She sat down on the frozen ground with her back against the cut bank, and took Rube Tandy's ruined hand and put it flat against the bare skin of her own stomach under her clothes, which is the way it is done when there is no water and no time, and she held it there. He made a sound. Then he swore at her, and then apologized for swearing, and then stopped talking for a while and put his head back against the bank. "You should have let me get to the fire," he said at last. "You would have lost the hand. I know it." The wind ground on over the top of the draw. "I said a low thing about you in September," Tandy said. "In front of the whole outfit, in your first hour on the place. You did. And a second one after that supper, and I meant that one too. And I have stood on it 3 months like a man standing on a rotten porch. His eyes were shut. Ma'am, I have been wrong about a great many things. I have never been wrong in a way that had somebody's hand in it. Mr. Tandy, let me get it out. I have been up since 4 yesterday, and I will not be able to say it in daylight." He swallowed. "There is 14 men behind me in this hole in the ground that would be dead out on that flat right now. Everyone come in the same way. Everyone come in following a thing you made. And I want you to know that I know it, and that I will say it out loud to any man in this territory who ever asks." Effie held on to his hand and did not answer for a moment. "You were not wrong," she said. "That is the thing I would want you to hear. A wagon in open ground and wind is the hardest work there is, and it does break people, and you were right to say so. You were only wrong about who it would break." Rube Tandy laughed. It came out cracked. "That is worse," he said. Ansel Merritt came in at 20 minutes to 8 in the first gray last of all, because he had spent the whole night going back for other men. He had found 2, and one of those he had carried. That one was a boy of 17 named Cy, who had a bad stutter and no people anywhere, and who had lain down in the lee of a dead steer 4 hours earlier and gone to sleep the way a person does. Ansel had come across him by pure accident and had been carrying and dragging him ever since. and had been lost himself the last 2 hours of it, going in a circle the size of a section without knowing it. And then he had walked across a smell. He came down into that draw on his knees in the end, with the boy still holding his collar, and got as far as the edge of the firelight and stopped because he could not for a moment take in what he was looking at. A fire under the bank with 16 men around it, a rope line strung with steaming clothes. 2 men rubbing a third one's feet, and Wicklow asleep sitting up with his mouth open, and Rube Tandy against the bank with his hand inside a woman's coat, and his eyes shut and his face wet, and a small girl sitting on a crate by the fire with both arms wrapped around the front of her coat, holding on to something, keeping it warm. He got the boy Cy to the fire and handed him off to Grady, and then stood up and looked at Effie Rusk across all that noise and light, with his mouth working and nothing coming out of it. "You have got 18, she said. "Everybody is in." And Ansel Merritt, who had built his grief into a wall and lived behind it on purpose for 2 years, and had not wept at his own wife's burying because he could not find the way to, put both hands over his face in front of his whole outfit and stood there and shook. The front blew itself out a little after 10 in the morning and left the country white and glittering and still. They lost 41 head, drifted and dead in a coulee 11 miles downwind, which in a December front on open ground is not a loss. It is a miracle with a number on it. Outfits on that same flat that same night lost 400. They lost no men. Effie Rusk had one thing left in that wagon to feed 18 frozen people with, and it was inside a 6-year-old's coat. She built the fire up and got the good Dutch oven down and scraped the flour sack for the last of it and took the starter back out of her daughter's hands and put her thumb into it, and it was warm and risen and working. "It lived," said Verity. "You kept it alive," said her mother. "There was no lard and no soda and nothing else on that wagon." She made a dough of flour and snow water and salt and 31-year-old sourdough, and let it come up in the warm by the fire while the men slept. And along about noon she baked it in the coals under the cut bank, 4 rounds of it, in an oven, with hot ash heaped on the lid. And 18 men who had been dead the night before sat in a hole in the ground in the sun on the snow and ate hot bread with nothing on it whatever, and not one of them ever afterward ate anything he thought was better. They came into Comus Wells on the 12th of December with 1,159 head. The beef sold and the note was paid. Ansel Merritt put the money on the bank counter and walked out of that building owning his own place free and clear for the first time in 9 years, and the man who came out onto the street was not thinking about the note at all. He found her at the wagon in the pens with her sleeves shoved up, scrubbing a kettle. "Mrs. Rusk," he said, and then he stopped, because he was no hand at this kind of talk, and never had been. Not even with Deborah. Effie set the kettle down and waited, her red hands going still. "I sent off for a woman to keep my house and feed my men," he said. "That was the deal I wrote you and the whole of what I let myself want, because I quit on wanting anything past that a long while back." He turned his cap slow in his hands. "I am asking you now for a thing I never put in any letter. I am asking you to stay. Not the cook. Not the arrangement I bargained for over a banknote. You, because I would be a poorer man every day I had left if you ever went." Effie Rusk had crossed 1,500 miles of her own grief to a yard where a man looked her up and down and named her somebody's tired aunt. She had earned every plate and every bared head the only way she had ever trusted, which was the hard way. She did not weep. She had wept enough in the dark to last her a lifetime, and this was not a thing made for weeping. "Jonah was a good man," she said. "I will not pretend he was not, and I will not pretend my heart is mended all the way through. But it is mending, Miss Merritt. It has been mending since the night your men took off their hats." She looked at him steady across the pen rail. "I will stay," I came north to keep from going under. I would a great deal sooner stay because I am wanted. They were married in the parlor at Camas Wells 2 weeks before Christmas, with Mrs. Peck weeping happily into her good handkerchief at having had a hand in it, and old Wicklow standing up as witness in a stiff collar very near to strangling him, and Rube Tandy in the second row holding his hat against his chest with a right hand that had kept all 5 fingers, and Verity in a new blue dress with a red ribbon in her hair, and the one-eyed dog waiting out in the wagon in the cold. By spring there was a garden broken and planted where Deborah Merritt's old beds had gone over to weeds, and Deborah's sewing basket had a place of honor on the shelf, and her hairbrush was wrapped in cloth and put away gentle for Verity to have one day, because Effie did not believe in shoving the dead aside to make her own room, only in living well in a house they had left behind. And the crock sat on the warm shelf behind the stove where it had sat in Cyrus Fenn's time, and Effie fed it every day of her life, and it was fed after her. She gave starts of it away, and that was the thing the country remembered about her longest. She would not sell one, not for any money, because it could not be bought. But she gave it to any cook who asked, and would promise to feed it, and by the time she was an old woman there was hardly an outfit between the Ember Fork and the Canadian line without a crock on a warm shelf that had come out of hers. And every one was the same living thing a man named Cyrus Fenn had carried out of Missouri in a wagon in 1851 and slept with between his knees so it would not freeze. Effie Rusk had come to a place that did not want her, and she had not begged it to want her, and she had not shamed it into changing its mind, and she never once made a speech. She had tied on a dead man's apron and lit a cold stove and fed a room full of frozen men until they took off their hats. And on the worst night that country had seen in 20 years she had burned an outfit's whole winter grease to put a smell on a wind, and carried live fire 40 yards in a stoneware crock with a living thing against her own skin, and brought 18 men in out of the dark by their noses. She had not changed. The woman who walked out of that parlor, the mistress of the Longwater, was the same woman who set her carpet bag down in the dirt. What had changed was that she was home. And on the bitter nights when the wind came off the divide and laid the grass flat and rattled the glass in the window frames, there was a lamp burning in the kitchen window of the Longwater, and bread set to rise on the back of the stove, and hot coffee for any cold and weary soul who came up that long road out of the dark, which was, in the end of it, the whole of what she had ever wanted, and a great deal more than she had once let herself believe she would ever be allowed to have.